So, um, wanted to introduce this practice to you today. It's a variation of the Zen Noting practice called the Phases of Insight. And we've in this training we worked with Zen Noting last week, and we explored what it's like as mindfulness to notice things. So in Zen Noting, as a reminder, you take the perspective of the thing you want to notice as. You become one with it, and that's kind of the Zen part of becoming one with. And then noticing what's happening is the noting part of seeing what you notice as that. So it's a real kind of hybrid of these kind of Zen and early Buddhist kind of mindfulness-based approach. I developed this practice inspired a lot by the Big Mind technique and by Kenneth's social noting. In a way, it's a mashup of those two practices. And what I found is really useful for is, it's useful for exploring anything, to be honest with you, like we did with mindfulness, but it's also particularly useful to explore certain models, to actually enact the model and to see what it's like from the inside. So often with models and teachings, we talk about them from the outside, right? From the objective perspective. There are these things that exist, these conceptual or mental models. And then we try to see, right, like by talking about them or asking questions or whatever, how they relate to our experience. You know, and does my experience actually map onto this map? Is it different? In what ways is it different? How helpful is this model? All of those are really valid questions. And I think for me, it's easier to explore them from the inside of the model than it is just from the outside, or from the inside and the outside. And you could add together to that as well, because we're going to do it out loud together. So there's both your internal experience of the map and model, the shared experience, and then the conceptual exploration of it. And to me, this gives a more comprehensive way to explore a teaching. So that's the kind of the basic idea. And the way we'll do this is we'll spend an equivalent amount of time on each of these phases of insight. And the phases of insight is a model that Emily and I crafted together several years ago, that was inspired by another older Buddhist model called the progress of insight. And this map describes 16 stages of insight knowledge, as it's described in the early texts. This map dates back to an early Buddhist commentary, a very central one called the Visuddhimagga, or the Path of Purification. That's the first place you can find it written down. So this map isn't a map that comes from the earliest Buddhist tradition. It's later added. And many of my teachers, myself included, found this map to be quite useful as part of the practice of noting meditation. Mahasi Sayadaw, the person who developed the noting technique originally, a Burmese monk, he sort of took the original Visuddhimagga commentary and he kind of updated it and made it relevant to his practice. Some of my teachers, Daniel Ingram and Kenneth Folk, did that again with Mahasi's maps. And then Emily and I took those. You see how these maps work. Every generation takes it and modifies it. And the modifications we made to the original 16 stages really have to do with simplifying the map, and not framing it only as a developmental process. The progress of insight is a developmental framing, right? And I think it often is experienced in developmental ways when people really start to get committed to practice, and pay attention to their experience, train their attention. These things seem to happen for many people, I'd say, or for most that I've talked to. But how you parse them out, how you describe them, how clear they are, that varies a lot. These things to me are much clearer if I'm on retreat practicing for a week or multiple weeks or months at a time. It's much easier to kind of see some of these patterns play out. There's also the interesting question of how having the model and the map affects your experience or your interpretation of your experience. Does the map actually script your experience, or does it describe accurately your experience? I think that's an interesting question. I'm not going to try to answer that here. Instead, we're going to maybe explore to see ourselves. This phases of insight map, it is pretty simple. There's 6 phases to this map. I will just name them here so that we're not getting so much into scripting the experience. Rather, we'll talk more about it after the practice is concluded. But the 6 phases, quite simply, are first seeking. So in the first phase, the seeking phase. The second phase is the effort phase, or just effort. The third phase is breakthrough. You can see how these could lead to each other, right? Seeking leads to effort, leads to breakthrough. This one's maybe a little counterintuitive for some folks. The next phase after breakthrough is disillusionment in this map. And then after disillusionment can come equanimity. Very common Buddhist phrase there. And then from and out of equanimity in this phase, in this model, the final phase can occur called completion. And in a way, that is both the end of this model and also the beginning of more modeling. Because it's not actually the end, it's like the beginning in some ways. The completion in some ways points to an experience of genuine awakening or enlightenment in the traditional sense. So that initial awakening is not the end of the path from a Buddhist perspective, but it's rather the beginning of your path of awakening. So that's, in some ways, this territory describes the beginning of the practice all the way up to this very important milestone in practice where one really has a deep and personal experience of what it is that one is seeking for. So that's the basic model itself. And then how the practice and the mechanics will work is we'll begin the practice and just take turns Zen noting as each of these phases. And the way we'll do it is we'll spend 5 minutes. We're going to have 30 minutes for the practice in this case. We'll spend an equivalent amount of time in each phase. So we've got 6 phases, 30 minutes will be 5 minutes per phase. And what I'll do is just invite you in this case to follow my cue in terms of the transition between phases. So I'll be keeping track of the clock, and after each 5 minutes, you'll hear me switch what I'm Zen noting as. So we'll take turns initially, just taking turns, Zen noting as seeking for the first 5 minutes. We'll just take turns, each person as seeking. And then you've got a whole breath here. It's a 1 breath practice. So as seeking, and then whatever it is that you notice as seeking. As seeking, I notice anxiety and confusion. Example, as seeking, I notice fear and worry. You can say anything you like here in terms of what you notice or what your experience is like. As seeking blank. And then again, you'll hear me transition to the next phase after 5 minutes. When it's my turn, you'll hear me say as breakthrough, and then, or I'm sorry, in this case as effort, and then the next bit. And we'll just keep going until we work through all 6 phases of insight. And at the end, we'll all be perfectly enlightened, and we can check back in and see what it's like.